This episode is brought to you by Factor. Ready to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor is here to help with a huge selection of delicious, chef-crafted, never-frozen meals delivered straight to your door. And they're ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Plus, Factor's Calorie Smart and Keto options mean eating healthy has never been easier. With Factor, there are no grocery trips, no cooking and cleaning, and it's way cheaper than ordering delivery all the time. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping.
Greetings, humans. You have entered the Command Zone, your destination for all aspects of Elder Dragon Highlander. Enjoy your stay.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Command Zone podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Weeks.
How's it? It's Josh Lee Kwai.
And today we are discussing the problems with deck building templates.
Yes, last week we gave you the new and improved, upgraded deck building templates.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are going to tell you what's wrong with deck building templates.
Yeah, today we're going to go through the template and talk about like all of the reasons you could stray from the template. So you start there. It's a good bit of information, but not every deck is exactly like the template, and it's not right for it to be exactly like the template. So,
I would go so far as to say that almost every deck is not exactly, the template's not exactly right for that deck.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of nuance, a lot of interesting things, and we're going to help you sort of figure out when to stray from certain parts of the templates or what to think about that might want you to stray. It's like that famous saying, you need to know the rules in order to break them. Mm-hmm. Last one was learning the rules. This one's about breaking them.
Yeah, today's the breaking rules episode.
That sounds way more fun. It's way more provocative.
Breaking rules.
Yeah, that's us.
If you want to break
rebels.
the rules while shopping, no, they follow the rules. You can go to cardkingdom.com/command. Card Kingdom has a huge selection of magic cards, your favorite thing and mine. They've got sealed product, they've got singles, everything that you need to build your next commander deck, whether you're following the deck building template or not. Maybe you watched last week's episode and you were like, you know what, I actually do need to run some more lands. Well, Card Kingdom's got them over there. They've got a ton of cards, and they're going to send it to you in the printing and the condition that you want. I'm always frustrated when I'm buying cards and I get slightly the wrong printing or slightly the wrong condition. We're picky about our cards, and luckily Card Kingdom knows cards and has a ton of them in one place so they can ship them to you in one safe package. Plus, if anything happens, they've got a great professional team to take care of you, make sure you get exactly the cards you're looking for in perfect condition. And you're supporting the show while you shop with them. So go to cardkingdom.com/command.
And of course, once you get those cards, you want to keep them protected. Ultra Pro is the game accessories brand that we trust our own collections to here at the Command Zone. They've got all kinds of cool products like Apex sleeves, which are just the best printed sleeves on the market if you want an image on the back of your sleeves, but you also want the shuffle feel to be amazing. You can't do better than Apex sleeves. They have the licensing agreement, so they have a lot of magic art on the backs of those, but they also have things like Mana 8 product, which is just the mana symbols. If you just, want to make sure that you know what's
Clean,
your blue deck and
sharp.
Yeah, and what's your red deck, you want to be able to tell the difference of those two things at a glance. Well, Ultra Pro has everything you need to make your battlefield look awesome, but also protect all your game pieces. So again, ultrapro.com/command. The best place to go to find all that stuff. And also, they often have tons of discounts. And that's one of the things I like the best about their website is they just, they're moving inventory around and they need to move some stuff out. And a lot of times they'll just discount stuff. And so if you're just looking for binders, you just keep an eye out. Every once in a while, you see some for like 30, 40% off. And that's a good time to pick them up. So just keep your eye on ultrapro.com/command. I kind of have a tab that I just refresh about once a week.
Bookmark it.
Yeah, exactly. As a result, I have way too many binders.
You just need to buy more magic cards.
No, I might play magic cards. I just need to actually organize them. Yeah. Trust me, I could fill all the binders.
If you want to support the show directly, if you want to buy Josh some new magic cards, he needs them.
I just need somebody to come over and organize them. I don't need more magic cards. Yeah.
There are people that would do that.
Yeah,
for
it's
you.
probably true.
I'd be very excited to do that.
I need a team, actually. I have so many cards, yeah.
You can support the channel and everyone here at the Command Zone by going to patreon.com/command zone. Everything that you give to Patreon goes to directly supporting this show and game nights and extra turns and everything that we do here. Plus, you get access to some cool perks. You get exclusive behind-the-scenes content like Turn Talk, where we just have a conversation after every episode of Extra Turns. You get to hear what was in people's hands, what they would have done if they'd drawn one more card, if they were like, I was too short of killing you there, but if you had done this, then I could have done that. It's a ton of fun. You get to see a lot of people's personalities and hear what was going on in the minds of the people in the game. Plus, you get access to our Discord. You can talk to us and our team and members of our community in the Discord, find some games. It's a ton of fun. So support the show. And we should shout out one lucky patron every single podcast episode. This one is dedicated to Jacob Breithaupt.
Jacob,
you rock.
All right. Let's get to our main topic here, which is the problem with deck building templates. There's, we did our template, our sort of upgraded new template for the new era video last week.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of templates out there. And honestly, I feel like templates are kind of like fitness regimes or maybe like diets.
Yeah,
where it's like, hey, listen, whichever one you follow, as long as you follow one of them, it's going to get you it's going to work.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to do a lot of cardio, that's probably going to get you. If you want to do like heavyweights, if you want to do like P90X, all that stuff, there are very fit people if they just stick with it.
Right.
So I think a lot of the templates, ours included, get you pretty far. Mm-hmm. But the problem is it doesn't address the specifics of like, okay, but now I'm building this deck. I'm building Corvold. Mm-hmm. And how many lands, how many ramp pieces, how many card draw pieces does, not in general, but does Corvold want?
Right. And like the deck building template can make things easier when you're making decisions where you're like, okay, I know I want to like roughly this many things. But sometimes you're like, okay, I put in the right amount and it doesn't feel like enough. I'm not drawing enough lands, or I'm always behind on mana, or I feel like I can't cast my commander when I want to. And that's because it's not one size fits all. It can give you a good starting point so the first game that you play is in like a decent spot.
Right.
But the deck will teach you more about itself than you could ever learn just by slapping a template on something and hoping it works. So today we're going to talk about, we're going to reiterate the template, but we're going to talk about all of the ways that you can sort of think about your deck and what things you consider when you're bending the rules of the template. You're like, oh, if I want to push this further and I want to cut this section back. And the ways you can think about your deck as an exception to the rule, because it likely is, even if like the template's pretty good.
Yeah, I think both of us still build decks to this day starting with the template.
Right.
Like Now, I never actually assemble the template version of the deck, but I just sort of put things in buckets according to card draw and everything else. And then my first like 110 cards or so are loosely, do I have I met the qualifications of the template? Do I have at least 10 of this and at least 12 of that, whatever. But then I think once you get better at this, you don't even have to like play it before you start to sort of think about, okay, are there reasons I might want more ramp in this deck than the average deck or less or whatever. And you can predict some of that stuff, and then some comes from playing in goldfishing that actually helps you dial in even more. But I think the big thing I would say to people out there, when you're straying from the template, it's still a good idea, especially if you're a newer deck builder, to start with it. But also, it's fine to just, have your categories look different than the template looks, as long as you just have a reason that you can state for why. Mm-hmm. Oh, I have less card draw in this deck because... That's it. You just need to answer the because. And if you have a reasonable reason why, then it could be fine. It could be the right way to go. And you won't really know, is it the right way to go until you've goldfished and played it a bunch. But, I think any deck builder would be like, okay, cool. That seems like a reasonable reason. Let's see how it goes.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to start with the template and just explain to you what we came up with last week in case you didn't watch that episode. If you haven't watched it, you should. We'll explain a lot of this in more detail and what reasoning we gave to get to these numbers. But without further ado, our new era deck building template includes 10 ramp cards, 12 card advantage cards, 12 targeted disruption cards, 6 mass disruption cards, 38 lands, and roughly 30 plan cards, which can overlap with any of the categories that we already mentioned, or they can stand on their own.
Yeah, and this adds up to more than 100 cards, right?
It does. It's like 108.
And that's because of overlap, right? Think of a card that has, just 2 modes on it, and one could be removal and one could be your plan. Maybe one mills you and one is a counter spell, like a card that says choose A or B, do this, that. Well, that could be that's one card that's doing two things, and that's why the number can add up to more than 100.
Right. A reclamation stage is both an elf for your elf deck and interaction.
There you go. Okay, so that's the general layout of the template. And again, we did a whole video about it, so if you didn't see that, probably check it out. Okay, so learning the rules before you break the rules.
Yeah, that's the next thing I wanted to talk about is like, okay, so templates aren't rules. Nobody's going to like arrest you. The deck police isn't going to come to your house and be like, you don't have 6 pieces of mass disruption.
Right.
Sir. But they do just give you a good place to start. So you're confident that the list of 100 cards that you came up with is like a reasonable place to build from. If you haven't used the template before, if you haven't used any sort of deck building template, I encourage you to try it. And the best way that I think you should do that is you get a digital deck building site. So we use ARCHIDEKT. You upload your deck list to that, and then you can sort things into categories on ARCHIDEKT. So you're like, okay, I consider this my card advantage, and this is a land, and this is targeted disruption, and this is more of like a plan card. And then you get to just look at the deck how the template would see it. So you're like, oh, I'm actually under the template when it comes to targeted disruption, but I'm over the template when it comes to ramp. And that may not be wrong, but that's a good thing for you to know about your deck lists if you haven't actually looked at it in that specific way. I never, ever build a deck without sorting it into categories first. That's just how I start building every single deck. It's like, okay, I'm going to make a ramp bucket, I'm going to make a draw bucket, and ARCHIDEKT will sort these for you automatically, but I like to do it by hand just so you're very intentional about it and you get to see the deck sort of progress. But to each their own.
Yeah, absolutely. This is exactly how I build the deck too. I just make the categories, and then as I'm pulling cards for the deck, I'm like, what is this? And it's going to be in one of the buckets. And
if it isn't, you're like, why is it in the deck?
Yeah, exactly. It's not on my plan, and it's not doing any of the other core things that decks do, like draw cards, make mana, or interact with my opponents in some way. Yeah, that's a pretty good signpost. It's like, well, this might not make it into the deck.
Right.
But it also is like just hard to deck build if you don't have some sort of read on like, what do I have too much of, what do I have too little of? And this gives you some numbers that like help keep you on rails. And again, then you would, you salt to taste a little bit from that point. Yeah.
Especially if you're the kind of deck builder, we talked about this in the other one, but where you like build it initially digitally and then you make changes as you go in paper. Every so often you need to like sort of go back to the digital list and compare it to the paper list and be like, oh, I've cut 3 lands in the last year.
That's the most common thing.
I am under where I would expect it to be. So I need to like do some work to kind of guide it back to the template if I don't think that's what's right for the deck. Or I need to recognize I'm like, oh, maybe the deck is actually okay running a few fewer lands.
Yeah, and that's why ARCHIDEKT is really, really good because they have a really awesome play tester. So you also can do the goldfishing part of it right out of that, right? Like you sort all your cards, you put it in, you make your deck, and then you just play it 50 times, 100 times. And once you get to know the play tester, you can goldfish so fast. Yeah, you converted me. I used to be like a paper goldfisher.
Oh, they're the best.
And now it's like, yeah, you can't beat, because you don't have to shuffle or anything. Just don't go, and I only go to like turn 5 or 6, and I can goldfish 100 times in like maybe an hour.
Yeah, it's awesome.
You just go super fast, yeah. And that just tells you like, oh, I just always only have 2 cards in my hand or 3 cards in my hand. And that's like, that's a card draw problem. Like I just don't have enough options of stuff to do. Or, I just am having trouble even deploying my cards. Oh, that's a mana issue. I need mana. So. Yeah.
That's, if you haven't goldfished before, we also did an episode on goldfishing that you should check out. It's How to Playtest. It's got a picture of goldfish on it. But that'll teach you sort of what to look for as you're goldfishing, and that goes along with the template. That's all sort of part of this process to make sure the deck is functioning at a high level.
Yeah, I'd say if you start with template, then you goldfish, that's the next step is where we are right now, which is like, okay, I put it together initially. I tested it. I learned some things, and now I'm going to tweak according to what I learned.
Right.
And I'm going to go off the template.
Yeah, I recognize that these things are wrong because I've goldfished the deck a lot of times. So how do I adjust for that? And how do I reason that? And there's a lot of reasons like why you would stray from the template. Maybe it's a meta call where you're just like, I don't really need this many board wipes. Like maybe we're more of a combo meta where like it's a lot more spell slinger than most. So I'm going to adjust in this direction. Or maybe it's like it's a personal preference where you're like, you know what, my playgroup really doesn't like, this kind of card, like Ghostly Prisons or whatever. So I'm going to adjust my template, my own personal deck building template based on my own meta. And it could, of course, be mechanical reasons, which is what we're going to be talking about the most, where you recognize that you're like, I'm a landfall deck. I can't just have the regular amount of lands.
I need 45 lands.
I need like 45 lands. I need 42 lands. Yeah. And if finding out what number is right for you is a lot of what we're going to go through today. So the first thing we're going to start with is we're going to go through each category and talk about when there are exceptions to the template. So we're going to start with exceptions for ramp.
Yeah, and I want to say we're not going to cover every possible exception that you could have for why your ramp might be different than the template. We're just going to give you some examples of how you might think about it, but you should extrapolate, for your own deck and the deck you're building, because obviously there's a lot of commanders and a lot of different decks, and so there's going to be a lot of sort of different reasons why you might. But I think hearing us talk about how we think about it will help you think about it in a different way, whatever particulars you're working on.
So a reminder is the recommended number of ramp cards is 10 for the average deck, but there's lots of reasons that you would want to increase that number or decrease that number.
Yep.
If you were going to decrease ramp in your deck, what are some of the reasons that you would sort of justify that?
The biggest one is like low curve. Like if I don't have a lot of spells in my deck that are over, 4 mana, then I might not need as much ramp because there's decks like the old Edric decks that are just like all 1-drops.
Yeah. What are you ramping into if your whole deck is 1-drops?
Yeah, you don't need a bunch of ramp. And you might play some like mana dorks because they are 1-drops as well. So they overlap, right? They're plan and ramp, but still you don't need a bunch of signets and other things because I'm deploying my cards really fast. I don't, the deck isn't super mana hungry as far as trying to cast like 8 or 9 drops. And if it's a little bit cramped, it can still cast spells. It's just like, instead of 4 spells, I can cast 3. Whereas if you have a lot of like 5, 6, 7 drops, you're like, instead of 1 spell, I'm casting 0 if I don't get to a certain point. So that's a huge difference. Yeah. So the punish, you think of your deck as like, how badly does it punish me if I don't have a certain amount of mana online? And a deck that has a low curve doesn't punish you very much for not having a certain, but a deck with a high curve does.
Right.
So that's one of the bigger things I would think about.
Yeah, I mean, my Octavia list has if you adjust some of the really high stuff, like Octavia I cast for 2 mana rather than 10 mana. Her average mana value is 2.16.
That's like less than a limited deck.
Yeah, I run 1 piece of ramp, and it's a spell that contributes to the plan. It is also a plan card. So it's one of those things where, like, I started with a little bit of ramp in the deck. I think I had 4 or 5 pieces, and every time I drew them, I was like, what is this Soul Ring doing here? I don't want this. I would rather this be a 1-mana instant that draws a card. So it plays a couple dozen 1-mana instants that draws a card, and that's why the curve is so low.
Yeah, and I think, that's the thing you can learn through goldfishing, right? Is like every time I draw this thing, it doesn't seem to be helping my plan or advancing me. It seems to be holding me up, even though it's in one of the categories, the number that they said, right? That's a pretty big signpost that's like, oh, well, maybe you don't want that. And then I like what you said there, which is like, what do I wish this was? Oh, why don't I try putting some of those in and then we'll see how that plays. And sometimes you do that and go, I wish it was this. And then you start goldfishing and you're like, I thought I wished it was that, but that's not it. And then it's like, well, maybe it's this. And you can just sort of iterate. But yeah, that's great. I mean, I think both of us like to play. I like to play really low to the ground decks in general. I love, Get Taxing Pro is like one of my favorite cards and it doesn't do anything. But it's just like, I just like doing things. And when my curve's low, I'll just know that I will do stuff. Whether it will win me the game or be effectual, that's a whole different, conversation. But yeah, so I often have, slightly less ramp than the 10. Just, again, for those reasons. Yeah,
I mean, if you have if you have a 2-mana commander or something like that, where you're like, you know what, I'm not going to cast a talisman on turn 2. I'm always going to cast my commander on turn 2. So maybe you run slightly different ramp. You're like, I'm going to run more expensive ramp because it doesn't fight on the curve with my commander, but that means I'm going to lower it overall, and because I'll ramp sort of later in the plan. Or maybe you'll sneak talismans in a little bit later in the curve, but you don't need as many because that consistency isn't super important.
Yeah, I think that's where your commander sits is a big sort of helpful signpost, again, to not just how much ramp you want, but what kind of ramp too. Because in that case, maybe you're like, oh, I'd rather have explosive vegetation type stuff that's like going to come down on 4. I think like something like Ishin is something where I wouldn't have a lot of ramp because if you think about the play pattern of that deck, I need to have something out that has an attack trigger when I cast my commander, and I need to get that online pretty early. So I don't really want to be on turn 2 casting a signet. I want to be casting a creature that when it attacks has a trigger, right? And then I'm going to cast a Shin, and then maybe at that point I might be ramping. But at that point, it's like at 4, am I ramping again, or do I just? My plan's going. Should I just be advancing my plan from that point? And I could see the Shin deck being a deck that has less ramp than your average deck for that reason, even though it's not a 2-drop and its curve is probably kind of low, but not particularly low.
Right.
So there's another reason, that's a third reason to think about. What's another reason maybe that you might have less ramp?
You have a commander that ramps. If you know that you're always going to ramp when your commander hits the battlefield, then that's sort of twofold, where you're like, okay, your commander fills that slot, so you know you have consistent ramp, then you don't need fewer in the 99. Or you recognize that you're like, my commander wants a ramp, which means I have a deck that wants a lot of mana. So I'm not going to reduce the amount of ramp I have in my deck because I'm a ramp deck.
In that case, it could go either way, where sometimes you're like, oh, I actually want more ramp because I'm building around the assumption I will have access to a lot of mana. So I have a higher curve or a lot of X spells or something that's like, when I do stuff, I'm going to put a lot of mana into it. And my commander is a piece of that puzzle. But some decks were probably like, hey, I'm not a big mana deck where I'm casting big things, but my commander does provide mana, which a lot of the reasons you put in a lot of ramp is not so that you get 6 of those pieces out. It's just so that you kind of, quote unquote, guarantee you get one in the early turns. So you get 1. So you're even with everybody. Well, my commander's going to do it, so I know I'm going to get 1. So I can have less in my deck now because I will have the one that I really is what I want. Because you don't put 10 signets in your deck, or whatever, talisman signets, Felwar Stones, thinking you're going to draw 3 of them in the first 3 turns. You're just like, I need to put that many amount in so that I will draw 1 in the first 3 turns. Yeah.
Right. Because you're trying to, the consistency is important there. So if it's just about consistency and it's on your commander, then you can reduce the amount of ramp you have elsewhere. Another one I was thinking about was if you're mana cheating in a different way. If like my Rakdos deck doesn't have a ton of mana ramp, even though the curve is really high, because Rakdos is a cost reducer. So it's like, I'm not trying to cast Eldrazi's fairly. I'm trying to do damage in order to cast them for free. So it's any ramp that I would put into the deck is only to get Rakdos on the battlefield or...
And I would think of Rakdos as a ramp card in that case, right?
Yeah.
So it's similar to when we were saying, if your commander is ramp. Well, yeah, I would imagine, let's say there's a commander that's going to cheat things out of your graveyard onto the battlefield. So I'm not planning to cast the big things. My deck curve is high, but I'd rather be milling early to get the things in the graveyard because my commander's going to come out and it's going to provide the quote unquote ramp.
Right.
Because that would, you could almost consider it a form of ramp. It is going to cheat the cost of that thing.
Yeah. Or like a cascade deck where you're like,
really
I'm
good.
casting 2 spells for every 1 spell, so I don't need as much ramp because I'm getting 1 spell for free every time I cast a spell.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's talk about some reasons. So that's all a bunch of reasons we might think of okay, I'm going to go below the number of ramp that the template says.
Right.
What are some reasons we might go above the amount of ramp that the template says?
Some of those are exactly what you'd think. It's the opposite. I have a very high curve. So I know that my commander costs 6 or something like that. Or my game plan really starts when I start casting this kind of spell or I start double spelling.
Yeah.
Then you're like, okay, I need the consistency of a lot of ramp to make sure I can get to my big spells, which is the plan for this deck.
Yeah, a lot of plans are just kind of mana hungry because they're you often find that one is a 2-step plan. I got to do this, then that. That plan already costs more mana, right? Because you got to do 1, then 2. Where Ishin is not that, right? I just got to attack, and that thing has to have a trigger. Well, that's one thing. But if you're like, oh, I gotta, play something, then sack it, then do this other thing. Okay, well, that's a lot more mana. So a lot of times those decks are we'll call them mana hungry. And you find that out in Goldfishing. We're like, I have the pieces of the plan, but I keep being like, I can only do 1 and then I got to pass the turn and do the other. And you're like, no, you just need more mana because you can't afford to be like, play this, cross fingers, go, hope I still have it to, actually enact the plan on my next turn.
Right. The other thing is what we were talking about earlier is consistency. Yeah. You're like, I have a 4-mana commander and I want it on the battlefield as fast as possible. So I really want 2-mana ramp in my opening hand. And in order to do that, you have to have more than 10. 10's just not enough to consistently expect to have a 2-mana piece in your hand every single time.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of commanders, it does feel really important to get it out at least a turn early just to sort of keep up in the game.
Yeah. Alternate, or if you have like a 3-mana commander in green, you run a lot of
one
mana
drops.
dorks. Yeah.
A lot of times the commander is the thing that kind of unlocks or starts your plan. And so it does feel right. And it frankly is right, quote unquote, most of the time to try and get your plan on as early as possible. So thinking about CMC of commander does sort of tell you a lot. Yeah, you put down landfall or artifact synergy decks. So we talked about it already, but if your deck is a landfall deck, it often will run a lot more lands for one thing and a lot more ramp. And the ramp will be in the form of like exploration and burgeoning and things like that, which all cheat extra lands into play, which are ramp cards. But at the same time, if you don't have lands in your hand, exploration doesn't do anything. I think we've all played the games with exploration or burgeoning where you're like, yep, I am allowed to put land into play, don't have though. And that's where you sort of learn like, oh, I just need 45 or so lands in my deck.
Or like what I was thinking is like you can run a lot of rampant growths in landfall decks because you're punished less for drawing them in the late game because it contributes to your actual plan. So these are ramp cards that overlap with your plan.
Yeah, they are your plan cards.
So you have more slots to dedicate to ramp because they're both plan and ramp.
Yeah, it's why landfall decks tend to be quite powerful and quite popular is because anything that rewards you for one of the sort of core pillars of the format, which is card draw and ramp, is going to be naturally powerful because it's like, oh, decks already have to do that a little bit, but you can do it a lot because it actually is going to pay you. It's going to make 4/4s every time you do it. And it's like, oh, cool. I already want to put a lot of lands into play because it's just good to have a lot of mana. But when I do that, I'm just getting creatures every time. Yeah.
And it goes the same for like a talisman, right, in an artifact deck, because that is part of the plan. If you have stuff that care about when you cast artifacts, well, those 2-mana rocks look a lot better in the late game than they would in the average deck.
Yeah, or if you can sack them for value, then it's like, okay, I draw it on turn 8. It would normally be like, meh. It's like, no, it's going to contribute to my engine. I'll play it. I don't care. I just care that it's an artifact and I can sack it to something or, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you have something to do with that mana, like built into your commander was another thing that we were talking about, where it's just like, if you have an activated ability on your commander, if you've got a mana sink, then have a lot of mana. You have somewhere to put it.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why like Thrasios is so good, because normally flood is a problem. So if you ever find yourself where you draw more ramp that you can spend, all your cards haven't really done anything. They've provided you with a resource that you can't use. And so if you've got cards in your deck, especially if it's your commander, that says, hey, however much you've got, you can use it, even if it's slightly inefficient, because Thrasios is not that efficient. But Thrasios is insanely powerful because it just says, hey, listen, you can't really over-ramp here. I'll provide you an outlet to spend that excess if you need it. And that ends up being like really powerful because then you can just be like, cool, I'm going to have a lot of my deck be ramped then. And if worst case scenario, I'm sitting there with 12 mana, I will turn it into cards. I will turn it into, also turns it into more ramp, which is kind of nuts. But those kind of cards, yeah. So anything that's got a pretty good mana sink. It's got to be a mana sink that you could justifiably use in a lot of scenarios. It can't be like a pump my whole team type mana sink because that's pretty specific. You have to have a certain board to do that.
The other one is just you have a lot of card draw built into your deck. Maybe your commander naturally draws a lot of cards. Yeah, you're like, okay, well, I have 15 cards in my hand, but I don't have enough mana on the battlefield to like use 15 cards. I'm still casting 2 cards a turn like everybody else, even though I have all these options. So you're like, okay, actually it makes sense for me to have more ramp so I can deploy more of the cards that I'm going to get in the late game.
Yeah, this is the biggest reason why I like card draw so much, and my decks tend to have more card draw and more ramp. You can have less plan because you're going to draw more cards to find the pieces of the plan you've got. So you think of the ramp and the card draw as an engine that once it's going, finds you the other pieces, but then not only did it find you the pieces, you have more resources by which to deploy them. So this is a very powerful combination, and you'll find as you deck build that ramp will make you want more card draw, which will make you want more ramp.
Yep, they do feed each other. Where it's like we're going to talk about exceptions for card advantage in a little bit, and one of the reasons to have more card draw is you have a lot of ramp. So we're going to go through every section of the deck building template. We're going to break down some of the other reasons for lands and card draw. And then we're also...
Oh, man. People are waiting around to be like, tell me the reasons
why can I
can
cut
have less lands.
Please?
Yeah.
I would love to.
The reasons are don't do that.
Don't do that. I was actually trying to come up with reasons, and there's like basically none.
Yeah.
But the other question we're going to answer after this break is we're going to answer how many you should have or how to find out how many you should have.
Oh, yeah. You did a lot of
I did
cool
so
stuff
much
with
math.
Yeah.
Stick around for math. But first, word from our
make them all stick
sponsors.
around.
No, it's fun math.
Good thing Magic players love math.
Whoa, Cinnamon! Hail, hungry friends! I'm Sir Ginger, Meal Ender! I know I can't end every meal. I mean, let's be reasonable. People need to eat something. So instead, I've made it my mission to end boring, unhealthy meals with Factor. They deliver fresh, never frozen meals that are ready to eat in just 2 minutes. No more harrowing journeys to the grocery store or grueling trials of cooking and cleaning. Each Factor meal is delicious and dietitian approved, making them the perfect companion to your personal health quest. And with over 40 options each week, spanning from the keto to the calorie smart, you won't have to settle for the same cookie cutter cuisine day after day. My favorite is the ground beef and thyme cottage pie for a delectable and hearty feast. And you can trust my opinion on food, for you may not know this about me, but I am food!
Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code FACTORPODCAST at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box.
Hi there, I'm Redshift. You know, there's nothing more important than love. And I love going fast! That's why nothing gets my heart racing like my RAYCON wireless earbuds! I don't have time to take an hour-long pit stop for dead batteries when I'm zipping through my favorite podcast at triple speed! But with RAYCON's quick charge function, 10 minutes gets me an hour and a half of juice! That's the kind of fast I'm looking for! Plus, their latest model is better than ever! They got 32 hours of battery life, multi-point connectivity, and all sorts of sweet activated abilities! Heck, these earbuds even come with active noise cancellation, which is great when you've got to block out engine noise! Vroom, vroom! And just like me, RAYCONs are efficiently costed, starting at just half the price of other premium brands. With a price like that, I knew I had to snap up a pair quick, especially since they came in my favorite color, yellow! What, you thought I was gonna say red? Joke's on you, I'm a complex person!
Go to buyraycon.com/command to get up to 20% off site-wide. That's right, you'll get up to 20% off everything on Raycon's website, including 20% off all headphones too, when you go to buyraycon.com/command. Again, that's buyraycon.com/command. Hi there, I'm Renma, Creaking Nest, but you can call me Friendma because all I want to do is make bird tokens for everyone. But once I've made my tokens, I've got to sell them, and I'm no salesman. I'm a scarecrow full of birds. That's why I use Shopify. No one does selling better than Shopify. They've helped me in 2 or more types of ways. Using Shopify has really helped my business grow, letting me sell my tokens all over the world, instead of just to my opponents. Plus, with Shopify, I get the #1 checkout on the planet with ShopPay, which helps me turn more bird browsers into bird buyers. In fact, Shopify is the business behind the business for many successful companies, including the Command Zone and Allbirds, who, despite their name, foolishly don't sell birds at all. But the fact remains, businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Because Shopify is for the birds, in a good way!
Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/TCZ, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/TCZ to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/TCZ.
I think it might need more card draw.
Who are you talking to? Or is that just something you say?
Oh, no, I'm on a call with Jimmy. We're building a Chatterfang deck.
Ooh, I just added Toski. That should help, right?
Whoa, the card just showed up.
Yeah, with ARCHIDEKT, you can collaborate in real time from anywhere in the world.
Changes show up immediately. You don't even have to reload the page.
So it's perfect for brewing with a friend.
This is cool, but isn't Jimmy just upstairs?
Yeah, but I'm downstairs right now.
I ain't coming downstairs. ARCHIDEKT is the best place to browse, brew, and playtest commander decks. Just go to archidekt.com/command zone to get started.
That's ARCHIDEKT.com/command zone.
Welcome back, everybody. We are talking about all of the ways and reasons to break open the deck building template that we released last week.
Do this, don't do that.
Don't do that! No,
Content.
we can be the person who pokes holes in our own thing.
Content creators. We're so smart sometimes. It seems exploitative. It's not, we swear.
It's not. It's useful.
Yeah.
You're advanced deck builders now, so now you get to break the rules. You know them, therefore you can break them.
There you go.
How do we break the rules on Card Advantage? This is
probably my most frequently broken one.
So the recommended number of Card Advantage spells is 12. It's higher than Ramp, more important than Ramp. But there are reasons that you could want more or less like actual Card Advantage.
Sure, we can talk about why you would want less first. That's fine. Yeah, and I think the first one on the list is similar to Ramp. If your commander has card draw or card advantage built in, then it's the same reason as with Ramp, right? Like a lot of the reason you want to have card draw in your deck is not so that you draw all 12 of them. It's so that you have a card draw engine going that's getting you, an extra card a turn or the equivalent or whatever. And if your commander, which you know you are going to be able to cast at some point, your whole plan's built around it, has that, you can sometimes afford to have less card draw elsewhere in the deck.
Yeah. I have pretty limited pieces of card draw in my Plagon deck. I just built a Plagon Beach deck because when he enters, he will automatically draw me 3 or 4 cards in this deck. It's just consistently going to draw me that many. It's an ETB on a 3-mana commander. So I have cut down on the consistency of drawing card draw elsewhere because I know I'm going to have it when I cast Plagon.
Yeah, and that makes total sense because the job of card draw is just to keep your hand full and have enough options to play. And if you feel that you've got that with your commander, then you really don't need a ton of backup. You still want some because, if the game was longer, if the commander gets taken out or God forbid somebody counters it or something. But yeah, it's...
God forbid.
I've had
Not
it happen.
my sweet boy.
I've had it happen.
He's a starfish wizard. You'd leave him alone. He's very powerful. You should probably counter him. The other reasons I was thinking about is if you have a lot of like alternate card selection that feed into your synergy or your plan. So if you're a self-mill deck that uses your graveyard like a second hand, or if you're reanimating a lot of creatures out of your graveyard, or if you have a ton of looting has been very popular lately.
I love looting.
Yeah, I mean, if you have like 15 cards that loot in your deck, it's not card advantage.
Yeah.
But you're going to see a lot of cards.
Yeah, and we talk about this in the template, and I'll talk about it here too, and it's a little bit related to like that art versus science thing we were talking about with the bracket system, which is like, I don't know, maybe there's a time traveling supercomputer in the sky that could get this right. But to me, I would count looters in those numbers as some amount of card advantage, even though there's no single loot that's actually going to, no single looting card. There is a loot that'll do it, but it's going to give you card advantage, right? Like you're drawing one card and you're discarding a card. So you're at the same number of cards when you started as when you end. So it's not technically card advantage. But because selection is powerful, and some amount of that time you're looting away lands that you couldn't use. You've got multiples in your hand. So it does kind of put you up a card. Even though I started with 5 cards, 3 of them were lands. I draw a card, I discard a land, but I drew a spell. I kind of drew a card, even though I'm not technically up a card. So some amount of that, and I might count 15 looters as like, I don't know, 7 card draw spells, 6 card draw spells. And then I would only need like 4 or 5 other ones in my whole deck, if that, depending on what my commander does. So that's the art versus science part. But I think it's okay to think in those terms, and whatever percentages you come up with are fine. You just, again, salt to taste once you're goldfishing. And you might be like, oh, I actually need less card draw, or I still need a little bit more because I'm still running low on cards.
Like physical cards.
Yeah, all my cards are good, but I wish I had 5 instead of 3 in hand all the time. I like what you said about self-mill and playing with the graveyard too. So, and I think we talked about this in the template, which is you can kind of sometimes think of cards that are like letting you look through your graveyard for a card. Even if it's like one card that pulls one card out of the graveyard, that's 1 for 1. So not technically card advantage, but because your graveyard could have 20 cards in it, it's like a tutor a little bit too, and the selection is actually more than a looter, so it's like, oh, if I had a lot of that, again, I don't know what the exact number is, but if I had 10 of those, I might count 5 or 6 card advantage cards, right?
Yeah, I mean, that amount of, like, you still see so much of your deck. I think we talked about it in the threat assessment episode, where, like, even if somebody only has, like, 4 cards in their hand, if they have a huge graveyard and they're a graveyard deck, you need to count that as them having 20 cards in their hand.
Yeah, think of like a Ball Again Recovery.
Very powerful.
And you got 20 cards in your graveyard. Yeah. It's like, oh, I only have, one of those cards kind of access to it, but it's whatever I need that I can see there. And that's so in some respects, it is like having, multiple cards in your hand. If we talk about, it gives you options. Well, my option is these 20 cards. That's a lot of options.
That's a lot of options.
Yeah.
The final reason that I found in my deck building is if you do have a very high curve, or if you're like an X spell deck and your plan is to deploy 1 or 2 really big spells, then having a ton of card advantage doesn't necessarily help you in the late game. So you really want card advantage, but you kind of want early game card advantage because you want to make sure that you have like efficient spells to cast in the beginning. But you don't need like those big draw spells that are going to load up your hand when your plan is to just cast a couple big things and have those win by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see big mana decks that are basically like all ramp and haymakers, and those can be good because your singular spell, even though it's not drawing you cards, is like doing so much when it lands because it costs 7 mana that it kind of is equivalent to like drawing 4 cards and deploying them.
It counts as like a couple cards because it's that good.
Yeah, exactly. So it's doing so much. So your plan is like, get to this amount of mana, start just playing huge things. This is, this is like Craig Blanchett magic. And it's very powerful. It's not like it's bad. It's just, it's sort of leveraging the power of cards in a different way. Or So it's not card draw.
It's quality over quantity.
There you go. Yeah.
You still need some amount of card advantage, but you don't need like 5 to 8 drops in your hand because you can only cast one of them.
I would say be very careful about both ramp and card draw, but card draw even more than ramp, about limiting, going below the number in the template. You'll rarely be hurt by having a little too much card draw, because worst case scenario, you've got too many cards. You just discard the card draw cards and keep the good ones, and you're fine, because having too many cards is not a big problem. But worst case scenario, the other direction is you don't have enough cards, and that's a big problem. Because you're either not doing much or just you don't have what you need when you need it.
Most of the reasons we gave for cutting back down on card advantage is if you have alternate forms of card advantage or card selection.
Yeah, so it's mostly about like, well, in that case, think of this as your card advantage and then recalculate.
Right.
Okay, but what is my favorite part about this discussion is when we talk about why would we want more card advantage in
Why
your
would
deck?
we want more?
So reason number 1 is you're building a deck.
Yeah.
All right, reason number 2.
And you like magic cards.
Yeah, exactly.
So why not more magic cards?
So the real reason number 1 is this very similar to our ramp discussion, which is just your curve is low.
Yeah.
So the problem with low curve is if you've got 5 1-drops in your hand and 5 mana, you're going to deploy them all right now, and then what are you doing after that?
I don't know. I'm out.
Yeah.
Go fish.
Yeah. So you're going to be able to deploy a lot of cards when your curve's low because all your cards cost little mana. So in order to continue to do things, you're going to need that throughput of like a lot of cards coming into your hand just because that levee is open, right? So it's just got to flow right through. But if it stops over here, if the water stops coming, well, if the levee and the levee don't dry something, I don't know. It's a song about it.
I mean, that's why like
Chevy to the levee. Yeah, that's what it is.
Like I think of like elf decks, they're all super cheap and they make a ton of mana.
Yeah.
And then you're like, I have no cards. So that
easy for that to happen where you do a lot and then somebody goes board wipe and you're like, I can't win. I'm top decking.
Right. I'm out, and elves like sort of work better together and the snowball gets happening. So if you have a lot of 1-mana creatures, you sort of need a lot of ways to draw more 1-mana creatures so you can keep fueling this board in case it gets wiped or removed or something happens that you're not ready for.
It's one of the reasons that Guardian Project is so good because it just naturally creates that flow that you want. Play card, draw card, play card, draw card. Well, I'm always replacing the one that I'm playing.
You can't overcommit if every card is replacing itself.
Yeah, I mean, eventually you have all lands in your hand. That's what happens. But yeah, that's what we call high-class problems.
The next thing is similar, but it's if your deck wins by casting a lot of spells.
Yeah.
If like your win con is triggered by like whenever I cast a creature or whenever I cast an instant or sorcery, usually those decks are full of really, really cheap things that you're trying to cast a ton of in one turn.
Yeah.
So you need a lot of card draw to make sure that you see all of those many spells that you're casting.
Yeah, and also, a lot of times that has to do with like a certain sequence near the end. And then, well, and a lot of times it's not specific card sequence, but it's like, I need this type of card, then this type of card, then I'm going to cap it off with this. Well, to make sure you have those even in your hand as options to do in that order, you need enough card draw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I already mentioned this one. If you have a lot of mana, then you need a lot of cards.
Yeah. So if you have a lot of ramp in your deck, then you will naturally want more card draw because what are you spending that mana on? You need things to spend the mana on. you have a low card quality. This is a really good one. And I think it's a good one for sort of budget and early deck builders. Don't have huge collections. And, I think if you're in a play group, and we hear about these people all the time, and it's a very common scenario, which is like, you're in a play group and somebody in the play group's been playing a lot longer or they're more invested, they spend more money on the game than you do. And as a result, it can often feel like that person kind of dominates. And one of the ways to get around, the fact that they've got better cards than you is you just deploy more stuff than they do. And so a lot of times, don't try and beat them at their game. Don't try and be like, I'm going to match every card you play card for card. The better way to go is to be like, okay, so what I'm going to do is just try and have a lot of mana and a lot of cards, and I will play 2 cards to every one of yours. And that I might be able to beat your, expensive cards in that scenario. But if I just try and go punch for punch, your individual punches are better than mine. They just are. That's okay. That's why we like strategy games. There are ways around. I always tell this parable. I haven't told it in years, but there was this guy I used to play basketball with, and his name was Henry. Way better than me. Way better than us and all our friends. Like, he was very good. He just didn't seem to miss. And but Henry was like, this is in my 20s. Henry was not as in good a shape as I was. And so what I learned was I could dominate him. Like, the first 6 months we played, Henry would just kill us. But I learned I could just try really hard to defend him, make him work his butt off. And it would kill me. Like, I would be drained and not very good on offense. But he would be so tired by this, 3rd or 4th possession that he would not try as hard, and he just couldn't. And I could keep Henry to a point. And then after that, we could just beat Henry's team every time.
Yeah.
And it's like, Henry's better at basketball than I am. I just was like, well, what angle do I have where I could beat him? I can be in better shape than Henry. And that's how, obviously not today, but... So, and that to me, I was always proud of, because that's gamesmanship.
Yeah, that's what can you do? It's like, okay, I'm not going to spend as much on cards as you. Or even if you're building a deck that is kind of janky. I know my Feldergriff combo deck is janky. I know. But I will draw more cards than you.
Yeah.
And I will play the ones that are good right now. And this is all trash and funny, but I have the right card for right now.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got your fancy cards and you've spent a lot of money, but there are ways around it. And I think that those wins can be more satisfying. Yeah, I couldn't grow. I couldn't be taller than Henry, but I could be in better shape. And so... Yeah, that's a really good reason to just have more card draws. Just be like, okay, straight up card for card, I'm not better than my play group. But so, okay, fine, I'll just have more cards than
I have more of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other one is if your deck is a multi-step plan. I always think of aristocrats where it's like, I need a thing that makes tokens, and then I need a sack outlet, and then I need a payoff. You have to have the card advantage to be able to assemble all 3 of those things. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with the wrong half of your deck in your hand, and you're like, I can't.
Yeah, all ways to sack things, nothing to sack, or all things to sack, no ways to sack them, and then no payoffs. That's why Aristocrats is a great one, because it's like, well, I need a thing to sack, I need something that lets me to sack it, and then I need something that says when you sack it, do this. That's 3 things. That's So to get that all to line up, you just need to have seen enough cards that you go, yep, this one, then this one, then this one. I have at least one of each of those in my hand, and the best solve for that is just look at enough cards. Yeah, that's really great.
It's the other example of that is land stacks. You need the card advantage really because first of all, you're dumping your lands where you can just play extra land drops a ton of times, so you're out of cards really fast.
Yeah,
and you need extra land drop enablers like exploration, and you need stuff that lets you play lands from the graveyard, and you need a landfall trigger, or you need your commander in play. So there's a lot of things that you need to assemble to actually make the strategy good, but if you have enough card draw, you can put all those things together.
Yeah, landfall decks often run into the problem where they spin their wheels and nothing's advancing towards a win. And when you have because you have room for relatively few amount of those pieces in your deck, because so many have to be dedicated to, hey, there's 45 lands. There's already just less cards, and then ways to cheat them into play, and then things that pay me off when I do it. And a lot of those things that pay me off are really ways to get extra ones into play. And then you're like, okay, so normally I would have in an aristocrats deck maybe 12 different ways to pay me when I sack a creature, but a landfall deck's like, I really can only afford 7. So I will see those left often, which means I need more card draw to make sure I get to those when I'm ready for them. Like, I've already got that engine going where I'm like drawing enough, putting them in, I can put a lot of lands in play, and now if I don't have the thing that says, yeah, but when you do that, make a 4/4, then I'm doing nothing, right? Land, draw, go. That happens a lot with land decks.
It does, absolutely. The final one that I want to mention that's a good reason to overload on card advantage is if it is what your deck's doing. If you're a cast from exile deck, if you're a when I draw the second card this turn, or like for the number of cards in my hand, if those are things that you're thinking about, then obviously you want to load up on those type of cards. Like my Pia deck is a cast from exile aggro deck. So it is low to the ground and it has Anthem effects and it tries to make a ton of Thopters to attack with, but it has 25 pieces of card advantage that allow me to cast from exile, which gets my plan online.
Right. Yeah. If card draw or card advantage is directly related to your plan, well, I take that as the biggest excuse in the world to just lean into it, which is great to do generally.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is when you build decks like that, you start to learn like, oh, I kind of want to do this all the time, even when it's not a direct payoff.
Yeah. Like every deck I build has the one that says, when I draw my second card per turn, I make a fairy.
Yeah.
Because I'm always drawing my second card per turn. It's, so if you have a very specific reason that, like, if it's paying you off for card advantage, that's what makes those strategies so powerful.
Yep. Okay, let's talk about targeted disruption, the one that is the most eat your vegetables of the entire bunch.
Yeah, so we changed the language a little bit on this one, but it's just, this is 1-for-1 removal. So it's counter spells or, swords to plowshares or like, I spend 1 card to get rid of your 1 card. And the recommended number for this is 12, which is a lot.
People don't like it. They don't like to hear that number. They don't want to have that many.
And I get it.
Because it's not the fun part of Magic.
It's not the fun part of deck building.
Yeah.
It is the fun part of Magic.
I don't think most decks are not built to like interact with their opponents. They have a plan they want to do. So they're not like, this feels off the beaten path. But it's a necessary part.
Sure.
Because you will just win a lot more games where you're able to stop the one thing they try and do.
If you don't die to 1 card.
Yeah, exactly.
And the more and more they've been printing commanders, like the reason that this number is so high is there's so many cards these days that it's like, if that's on the battlefield for longer than a turn, the game is over.
Yeah.
So you just have to have an efficient way to get rid of it and be able to progress your plan on the same turn. But there are reasons why you would go under 12. There certainly are. And the first one is you're a hyper-aggressive deck and your plan is to remove the player. Like, my Dragon's Approach deck doesn't run very much interaction at all. Because it's like, you know what? I'm going to focus on my thing, and I'm going to get it done, and if I can't do it in time, then I lose. That's the kind of deck it is. If there's, like, one thing in play that says I can't deal non-combat damage, then we'll figure something out when it comes.
Yeah, this is the classic reason in like 1v1. It's tougher in Commander just because, sure, you can remove 1 player. What do you do about the other 2? But yeah, it is an interesting way to think about it, which is I'm going to try and kill people. I will be the problem and let them try and answer me.
Right.
And I think, there are definitely decks that fit that mold. Be careful, though. You have to be really, really doing that.
Yeah.
Some people think they're doing that, and you're like, you're not that aggressive.
Oh, yeah. Dragon's Approach is as I'm spending cards for damage.
Yeah.
It is as aggressive as a strategy gets in
You
Commander.
have to be really aggressive at it before that actually works.
Right.
I like this next one, reason to have less targeted disruption, which is you have ways to reuse your removal. So either like Blink, Reanimate, you've got, Archaeomancer, Snapcaster Mage type stuff. I do this a lot. It's almost overlap, but Torrential Gearhulk is like one of my favorite cards of all time. And it's because it's that thing we talked about. Like, oh, instead of just this representing one thing, it represents all the things that are in my graveyard, all the instants that were there, which means that it can be removable, but it could also advance my game plan if something else is in there, and it can also be card draw. And so I think you can sometimes 1-for-1. I think you have to meet a minimum threshold before you can do it, though. You can't have 1 removal spell in your deck and then say, my Torrential Gearhulk is my second removal
That'll
spell.
find it.
Yeah, because you probably will. You probably get your Torrential Gearhulk before the Swords to Plowshares ever showed up.
Right.
Yeah.
You do need to, that needs to be a major part of your strategy. Like, I think my Sidisi deck only runs 8 pieces of targeted interaction, but it has lots of ways to, sack creatures, copy creatures, and bounce them and replay them.
Yeah.
So I'll be able to find them. So that's, all right, I will have some kind of piece that I can figure out how to reuse this card.
Yeah, I don't have 10, or I don't have 12. I have 9, and I have another 8, 9, 10 ways to reuse them. So I actually kind of have like, again, this is the art and the science, 13.
Sure.
Which is close, yeah. Another reason is you're in colors without strong or flexible targeted disruption.
I think of this largely as green.
Mm-hmm.
If you're playing a mono green deck, or if you're playing a mostly green but a little bit red deck, your targeted interaction just isn't that good. And running a lot of bad cards to plug this hole just means you have a lot of bad cards in your deck.
Yeah, Kibler said this on the episode. He talked about it, and there's a famous saying that I like to quote, which is, if you work really hard on your weaknesses, well, then you're going to end up with some really strong weaknesses.
Doesn't make green removal better.
Yeah, so in some instances, especially green, it is better to just not try and shore that up and just grant, I'm not going to have great creature removal. So I'm not going to run a bunch of bad fight spells if I'm not a fight spell deck. I'm just going to say it will be difficult for me to destroy creatures, and the way I'm going to get around that is either play removal or just enact my plan before they're ready to, or politics or whatever.
Or like, my creatures will be bigger than yours, or my creatures will have trample. You're like, I will find other ways to make creatures not a problem for me, rather than playing a specific targeted removal spell to get rid of a creature. Green's just not good at that.
But in green, I would still run enchantment and artifact removal because they're very good at it. So I just wouldn't run, I wouldn't run the bad ones. And then red, of course, has similar problems. Not so much with creature removal because it can do direct damage, but with like artifact and enchantment removal. Enchantment removal. Artifacts is fine.
Artifact you can do, yeah. It's I always find red is really good at getting rid of creatures because there's so much good like repeatable burn on permanents. Like, Warstorm Surge can go like at creatures and that kind of thing. But when it comes to answering enchantments or even just trying to like red going 1-for-1 with another deck, its card advantage isn't good enough to keep up with that. So you just can't go down cards that much when you're playing a red deck, when you don't have blue or another color to sort of bolster that card advantage, of course. The other one that I included is you have fewer slots to dedicate to removal, so you're running more mass disruption. And I find this is often in decks like aristocrat decks or in decks like land decks, where you know that your slots are just going to be kind of tight. You know that there's not going to be enough to include all this stuff. So you're like, okay, I'm going to run fewer 1-for-1 spells, but I'm going to run like a Grasp of Fate that can remove 3 creatures. Or I'm going to run more flexible removal. Like, I'm not going to run Swords to Plowshares, but I'll run this Generous Gift or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. We're going to talk about mass disruption next, but the template says about 6 pieces of that. If you're more like 8 or 9, then you could probably take out 2 or 3 from your targeted removal, because really these are just sort of these are ways to split up the same thought, which is like, can I do something about what my opponents are doing? And this is like, I can pinpoint do it, and I can on a bigger scale do it. And if you're like, well, I'm going to do it on a bigger scale more often, it's like, okay, I don't need to pinpoint as much then. Right. Because there will be less there because I dealt with it
in another way. In a more nuclear way.
Another one we didn't put on the list, but it occurs to me right now, is it's similar to ramp and card draw, which is if your commander has removal on it, then for the same philosophy, you're not trying to draw 12 removal spells in a game. You're just trying to have it when you need it. So the commander could give you removal, like the new loot or something has a lightning bolt on it. Now, yeah, I would count that as a removal piece and probably be able to go down to 11, saying like, I'll probably have my commander in play and be able to remove something. Now, it's not perfect. It's a lightning bolt. I used to think of this. I have a rune deck. It's really old now, but like rune can blink your opponent's thing, which is not the best removal, but it does tick the box sometimes and does turn things off and does get blockers out of the way and can do interesting things. So I would count it in that, as like in a pinch, I can do that.
Expensive Maze of Ith, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I count, and Maze of Ith, I count in the same category, right? So yeah. So I think if your commander has a removal aspect to it, because you have access to it, it definitely could count and could make you say like, okay, I only need 10 or whatever.
Yeah. And I know 12 sounds high, but this also includes like tap effects. This includes phasing out effects. This includes like a wasteland. Anything that trades 1 card for 1 card in a problematic situation is considered targeted disruption. So we've sort of lowered the floor on what it takes to qualify for this, because sometimes it's just like, you know what, I'm going to goad that thing, and that counts. I would count that
I'm
as
messing with
targeted
that
disruption. I'm interacting over there. I'm waving, like I'm distracting them from what they want to do.
Yeah, I have a Tim deck, and Tim taps to deal 1 damage to any target. And the deck really is, there's there's many versions of that card over the years, and I have like 5 or 6 of them in the deck. Not 20 like a lot of people think.
Right.
And then I have a bunch of untappers, things that untap the Tim, but can also untap other things because they become toolboxy. And all the untappers count as removal because they could untap Tim or any of the other cards. There's some that tap and destroy artifacts, and right? So now I have a thing where like those untappers, Kior's Follower, is actually playing a lot of overlap. It's a removal spell, but it's also a ramp spell, but it's also, you see what I'm saying? And so that's how you can kind of get to 12 targeted removal spells. And that deck probably has like 20 counting all the untappers.
Yeah.
Because of so much overlap, those untappers are actually on their plan cards as well, and their ramp cards, and their card draw cards, right?
Right.
Because I have things that tap and draw cards in that. So those hinge cards that like, you know, the ones that get things out of your graveyard or self-mill you, that's the same thought of like, oh, that can find me removal sometimes, but when I don't removal, it'll find me, you know, a plan piece or whatever. So, yeah, you do have to meet, again, the minimum threshold to make sure that you will have seen those, because untappers don't do anything if there's no removal creature out there, no Tim out there, Okay, let's talk about why you might want to run more targeted disruption than the norm, which is, okay, go ahead. You're getting excited about it.
I realize I run way more targeted disruption than I ever thought I would, because I run a lot of flexible cards that can sort of be like tap your thing or untap mine.
Yep.
But I think the first reason is just you play at a higher power level.
Yep.
You expect card quality to be higher. You expect games to end faster. That means you have to have at least one piece of targeted disruption in your opening hand, and you want to draw one pretty soon after that.
Yeah.
So I would say if you're just playing more powerful decks, you need more targeted disruption.
Yeah, totally agree. And as you go lower, you need a little bit less.
Yeah.
The other one is related to everything we've talked about, which is you just have a lot of card draw or card advantage. You're just going to see more cards. So again, the idea behind having 12 is that not that you see all 12, just that you see enough of them, 1 or 2 or 3 over the course of the game. And if you're seeing more cards, more of your deck throughout the game, you'll just have more chance to find them. So you might not need quite as many.
Yeah.
Don't go down to like 5. It's like maybe you only need 10.
This is why you can play more. And like, I think if you have more card advantage, you're actually at license to play more targeted disruption, because you can go down cards against people, right? If you're like, okay, I know I'm going to draw like extra cards than everybody, so I can have 2 Swords to Plowshares, and I can afford to like trade 1 card for 1 card and go down against your 2 opponents more often. And they're efficient, so they're like go with this sort of cheap plan of card
well,
advantage.
here's the joy of card advantage. I think it can go
it also
both
goes the other way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're right.
You can justify it both ways. I justify
That's
things
why card advantage is so good.
Well, and another thing about card advantage is so the problem with targeted removal is if you draw a lot of it, you're not doing your plan, you're only stopping other people's plans. And if your deck is not a stop other people's plans type of deck, not control, then you can be in a situation where like, I got 3 removal spells, but I'm not doing anything. And so now I'm the police, which is not where you want to be at a commander table generally. And the good thing about a lot of card advantage is you can just be like, okay, I'll just discard 1 or 2 of them because I still will keep 1 or 2.
Right, yeah.
And so if you have too many, it doesn't hurt you as much because you don't,
Right.
Oh, yeah, I forgot we were under more.
Yeah, this is more. The next one is if your plan is compact, so it doesn't take up a ton of slots in your deck, and it tends to be on the slower end. So if you know that you're like, okay, I only have to dedicate a few cards to this plan, and when I draw it, I'm set up, but it's going to take me a little bit to get to that place, then I think I would lean a little bit harder on the targeted disruption. Make sure that you have enough defense that when you're still setting up and when you're still in the early phases of your plan, you're not just getting run over by the other creatures on the battlefield.
Yeah, and you can just pick apart their strategies to slow them down. You're trying to throw out speed bumps for them so that your plan's a little slow. You can get to the point where you're ready to enact it. I think it also works if your deck's really powerful and the plan's compact, because that's kind of what CEDH is.
Yeah, for sure.
Generally, CEDH is like trying to get 2 particular cards together, and the rest of the deck, or most of the rest of it, is trying to like be able to slow your opponents down and protect when you go for it. Another reason to have more targeted disruption, this is my favorite reason, is when you are regularly holding up a lot of mana. So if you're the type of deck that's going to pass the turn with mana open just because that's kind of what your plan is, then targeted removal comes really, really well because, and this, I like to play this way because I just like more information. So it's just like, go, if you attack me, I'll probably remove a thing. If you don't, I'll do this other thing. And that's a very powerful way to play.
Yeah. The final one is if you have synergy that goes along with it. So this is similar to like the landfall and the artifact synergy that we talked about with ramp. If you are playing a spells deck that pays you off for casting instants and sorceries, or if you're playing like an enchantress deck that pays you off for casting enchantments, obviously you'd be picking different kinds of targeted disruption. Then you'd be picking more enchantment side or more spell side. But now the crossover with your plan is greater, so you have more slots that you can dedicate to your disruption.
Yeah, I love that. Just like everything, if you're synergizing with one of the core sort of tenets of the format, it's very powerful because you get to lean into that, and you should.
The more overlap you have, the more space you have for vegetables, which is cool. Like my Sidisi deck runs like 62 creatures or something like that, which is absurd.
Yeah,
that is a bananas number. And it's because like every single thing, all of my rampus creatures and creatures work with my commander, all the removals creatures and all of the creatures that remove, also a few of them are self-mill. So like all of your synergies,
creatures and all that,
So your synergy just becomes so much higher if you can, the more you can overlap all of your sections, the more vegetables you can have, the more powerful your deck feels.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so the next category is exceptions for mass disruption. Now, the template calls for 6 mass disruption type spells, which we've already clarified, not just board wipes. This could be a Grasp of Fate or something that's like a Decimate, right? That's something that reaches out and gets rid of, deals with, more than 2 things probably.
Yeah, you spend 1 card, you handle a couple of things. So even like a Disrupt Decorum that goads the whole board, I'd consider that a mass disruption spell.
Okay, so what are some reasons we would want less than 6 mass disruption spells?
I think if you're a more aggressive strategy, again, you're probably a little lighter on the disruption just overall because your disruption is putting people on the back foot right away. So if you are a very aggressive strategy, you're probably leaning more on one-sided disruption or like the goad stuff that doesn't affect your board. But anything that you can kind of throw out speed bumps to slow them down. But you probably don't need as much because, again, you're shoving them on the back foot in a different way, which is just sort of a different strategy of disruption. So you probably don't need like 6 board wipes.
Yeah. The more proactive you are, the less board wipey you probably want to be. Right. And the more you're like committing to the board, the less board wipey you want to be. Doesn't mean though that all mass disruption is board wipes. So, but it might be hard to find 6 disrupt decorum type spells.
Right.
Yeah.
I really like in that kind of deck, in like an Ishin, the front foot deck, spells that tap your opponent's creatures. Like just tap all of their creatures because it just buys you another turn in the early game. And it's previously for me, it's been hard to find slots to put those cards into. But when you start thinking of it as like, oh, I'm disrupting their plan, I'm getting rid of their defenses, it makes a lot of sense.
It justifies itself.
It justifies itself. Yes, that's true.
Okay, the next reason is you're in colors without strong or flexible mass disruption. Similar to... Yeah. So green, pretty bad in general at mass disruption at all. Definitely like board wipe creature stuff.
Yeah, you definitely want like a Bane of Progress or like something that just destroys all the enchantments on the board if you're not leaning into the enchantment side, of course. But you're not going to have a ton of ways to like kill all the creatures on the battlefield. That's not what green does. So you know that you need to be more proactive. Therefore, you're probably less reactive.
And red's also pretty bad at like non-damage based wraths. So, but it's got Disrupt Decorum and
Vandal Blast.
Yeah, Vandal Blast is great. So there's 2.
There's a couple. 6 is just sort of a high number to get to when you're in those colors.
Okay, why would we want to run more mass disruption than the 6?
It's very similar. Is like you don't commit a lot to the board, so you're probably running a little bit more board wipes because they don't affect you as much.
Yep.
Or like you're a spells deck, so you're like, all right, just get rid of as many permanents as possible so I can work on an axis that works for me.
Yeah, a lot of spells decks are just sort of concentrated on like setting everything up. And if that setup isn't creatures, then they're like, cool, I'm going to board wipe to sort of get everybody back to zero, but I'm ahead based on the other setup I put out. A lot of decks are kind of like that too. Yeah, but we don't want to encourage people to run too many board wipes.
No, these aren't all expected to be board wipes. I would say that like I usually run 2 to 3 board wipes of the mass disruption spells, and then other ones are like, okay, I can like bounce multiple creatures, or I can phase out your board, or I can exile your graveyard is considered mass disruption as well. So there's a lot of things that could meet this bar, and it's flexible for a lot of the different colors.
Man, graveyard hate. Talk about eating your vegetables.
Yeah, you gotta have it.
Yep.
The other one I wanted to mention is like I prefer mass disruption if I know my deck is going to be public enemy number 1. Like if I know that I'm the one that's messing in everybody's business, then I need to have an answer for a lot of different stuff.
Right.
And that for me, that's usually like a goad something that it's like they're going to want to attack me because I've had an impact tremors for the entire game or something like that.
So I want to be able to like turn that all away from me. A lot of times you can win games by just knowing when that moment is, doing it at that one moment in time, and then that allows you like, I just needed that one turn, and here we go. The last one says, you don't have a lot of slots, so you lean more on mass disruption rather than targeted.
Which we've already sort of talked about, but it's like just making sure that like, okay, I only have 6 pieces of removal, or like of mass disruption in my deck, but I know that when I cast it, I'm going to handle at least 3 problems on the board.
I think another thing I would think about as well is if I have a lot of protection, I might be more prone to have more mass disruption. So
it's a great answer.
If I have Teferi's protection, if I've got something that gives all of my stuff indestructible or 1 or 2 heroic intervention type stuff, because now I have the ability not only to just reset the board when I'm in trouble and that's the only way out, but also to use it offensively. And so it becomes a lot better as a tool than it's like, oh, I can sometimes be like, give my stuff indestructible, wipe the board, and my stuff's still around now, attack. And that's a totally different proposition.
Yeah. Or if you have a lot of recursion, works on the same side. So if you're like, I'm a graveyard deck and I can reanimate my whole graveyard multiple times, then you might run a couple extra board wipes because they don't affect you as much.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, we are going to move on to the Fabled Lands section. The recommended number of lands is 38. I'm serious. 38 lands.
Don't cheat. 38.
You can play some MDFCs. It's okay.
38. I'm looking at you.
But
I know you cut lands every time. Jimmy.
Jimmy, if you're watching this, 38. But there are reasons to run fewer lands, and there are reasons to run more. There's a lot more reasons to run more. But let's start with fewer. Predictably, you have a low curve.
Yep.
You're like, I only need 5 lands in play to be a menace. Maybe you don't need to hit 38.
Probably you still do that.
Probably you still do that. And I'm talking low.
Yeah.
Like 2.5 and under, low
It's
curve.
hard to get a deck that low. Try it. It's not easy.
Like Octavia, 2.1 is the average. Low. 36 lands. Which most people start at 36.
Yeah. The next reason you might have fewer lands is you have a lot of card selection / advantage. And it has to be low mana cost to get it. A lot of cantripping, I would have slightly less lands. Because the problem with cantripping tends to be that you hit a bunch of lands in a row and then you end up with lands in your hand. And you're like, I'm going to cast this, draw, cast that, draw, cast that thing, draw, cast that, draw. Well, the only problem is some of those will be lands and you'll eventually be like, crap, I don't have any spells left.
Right.
So you actually want, if you're cantrippy, you want just a couple fewer too. It's like 36.
Yeah, it's like 36. If you have a lot of fast mana is the other side of this. If you're in CEDH or you're playing as many like 0 and 1 mana acceleration, that sort of counts as lands. It's dangerous, but that is how that game works.
Yeah, CEDH, I mean, they run all the 0 mana rocks and a lot of the mana vaulty type stuff, and a lot of them can actually function with no lands in certain scenarios. No
lands on the battlefield. It was not no lands in their deck.
Yeah, but they can keep no land hands.
Sure, yes.
Sometimes, which most decks are not built to be able to function under that scenario. But they're so efficient and they're so focused on getting to their plan really fast that they often have like 20 ramp pieces when you break it all down. And so it's like, okay, 20 ramp with 30 lands. That's a different thing than your deck, which is still 10 ramp, but trying to talk itself into 32 lands. Don't do that. Yeah, but I also wouldn't normally be able to say you're okay to replace ramp with lands. Don't think of it in that space because your ramp costs mana.
Right.
So you can't deploy it if you don't have mana already. And really, it's similar to the targeted disruption where we're not putting in 37 lands in your deck so you'll draw 37. 38.
Yeah.
38. We upped it by 1, so I'm still in the old days.
Yeah.
But it's just so you'll draw enough by the right point, right? Like that's what we talked about in the template episode. It's the goal here wasn't to draw all of them. It's to draw your fifth land, your fourth land on time, your fifth land on time. So the fact that you have a lot of ramp doesn't necessarily solve that problem. So yeah, and that's the easiest way to lose game, and I think the most common way to lose games, although people forget by the end, but that's why they lost it. But like just missing your fourth land drop.
Yeah, I think it's a really bad habit among casual commander players is that you're like, I'm okay, I'm running 15 rampant growths, so I can run like 32 lands. And you're like, no, if you don't play your land that turn, then your rampant growth didn't ramp you.
It actually just cost you 2 mana to do what you could have done for free.
Yeah.
If you just had a land in your hand. So the rampant growth, if it was just turned into a land, was better for you in that game because then you could have played it and then cast a 3-drop.
That was one of my biggest adjustments for the deck building template was decreasing ramp and increasing lands. Because I just think we've shifted too far in the other direction. But those are the reasons. That's the end. That's the end of the reasons that I will accept for cutting lands from your deck. MDFC is fine. You can count them as lands. You can run 6 MDFCs if you want. You're going to cut into your life total, but they'll count as lands. But you have to hit 38. Thank you.
Yeah, I think every deck I build now has 4 MDFCs minimum.
Yeah.
It's just, they're spells and lands. That's what we call overlap.
They're expensive, so it's like, I get why if they're not in every deck, but like ideally every single deck would want.
Yeah, even the cheap ones are fine though. Like even the one that's Glasspool Mimic's not expensive.
Oh yeah,
just
I play
run
that
it.
in tons of decks. Yeah,
it just does give you another thing you could do when you're flooded.
Yeah.
By the way, this is the only section you put.
Not
like here. These are not reasons you can run fewer lands. Not in bold, by the way. Yeah.
Not. This is not a reason to play fewer lands. Your playgroup has a very lax mulligan policy. You will still get mana screwed.
People don't understand. The number of lands in your deck is not necessarily for how many you have in your opening hand. It's also
when you draw them,
the frequency of drawing them. We're talking about hitting your 4th and 5th land drops, which you can't see from your opening hand,
right?
Because you're not keeping hands with 5 lands in them, opening hands.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's that is not a good reason to cut lands from your decks. Another not a good reason is I'm just always getting flooded. That isn't a land problem. That's a card advantage problem. You need more card selection or card draw. If you have too many lands in your hand, that just means you're not seeing enough cards.
Yep. You have another knot.
But I needed slots for my spells.
Yeah.
You can't play your spells without your lands. You can't.
Yeah, it is useless to put in more spells when you don't have enough lands. You just won't be able to cast them, so what's the point?
Yeah. So here's my strategy.
Maybe some people are like, I really like to look at my spells, though.
Yeah.
I like to see them.
Look at them I don't want them on the battlefield doing what they do.
I
just want to
cast them. I just want to look at them.
That's fine.
Yeah.
They're like foily and they're shining, like showing your face back. Yeah. That doesn't work. So here's my strategy. If you have spells that you want to put in your deck but you don't have space for it, build another deck. Put 38 lands in that one.
Or just I've done this. Just alternate. Just be like, I always wish I could put these 3 in. Just put those 3 in place of any of the other 3 spells that are there sometimes.
Cut your ramp. Just kidding. We're telling you reasons.
Yeah.
Good reasons.
Like, the deck can change game to game. You can be like, cool, now I'm going to put in these 3 for those 3. And next time I play it, it'll have those 3 that I wish I always could have put in. Look, I put them in. I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah. The biggest thing that will tell you, well, I guess let's talk about reasons you might want to have more lands in your deck first, and then we can wrap it up.
I want to do one more caveat on the lands. Is when you're reducing your land count, I don't want you to go from 38 to 32. I want you to go from 38 to 37, 37 to 36.
50 times.
Yeah, I like whittle away at your land count. Don't make giant chops at it because that's how you get yourself into trouble. And just get mana screwed, which is no fun.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about reasons why you might want to have more lands in your deck.
It's what you predict. You have a high curve. You've got a high mana cost commander. You know you're trying to cast 6 drops, 7 drops. You know you're going to be pulling a lot of basics out of your deck.
Yeah.
All of those are reasons to run more lands.
Yeah. Yeah. You're going to need to cast big stuff. You're not going to do anything if you don't get to that amount of mana.
Maybe you're running less ramp. Maybe you're like, you know what, I've got a 2-mana commander and I'm not really interested in accelerating, but I do want to hit my land drop every single turn.
Yeah,
so
I'll be fine as long as I just have the amount I'm supposed to have.
So I'm just going to I'm going to spend maybe 4 or 5 slots dedicated to ramp. That's fine. And then I'm going to run like 2 or 3 extra lands.
Yep. The next one is you have a lot of card selection or advantage.
This is also why card selection advantage is so good.
Yeah.
Because flood doesn't hurt you if you're running more lands. It just means it guarantees you're going to hit those land drops.
Yep. Yeah. I even think like looting is really good, and it might make you think, oh, I need less lands because I can, if I don't get one, I can loot away. I can loot into. And it's like, no. You want to be looting away lands. You don't want to be looting into lands because you don't know if you're going to draw the land and then you might miss the land drop. It's way better to be like, I have too many. Let's get rid of one and hopefully draw a spell here.
Right.
So if you have a lot of looting, it actually is licensed to run a few extra lands because normally you would worry about flood, but you have a solve for the flood. It's called looting.
I want your default commander experience to be you get to play commander. And the way that you do that is by running enough lands. If you sit down and you're regularly frustrated with your deck and you're like, my deck never works and I can never get it to do anything, just start by running a few more lands. Yeah. And again, you can whittle. You can add 1. You can add 2. That makes a big difference. Another one I wanted to mention is if you're mulliganing for something specific in your hand. So like Rakdos Lord of Riot, so I always want a damage doubler on turn 2 or turn 3. And I need to have one of those or I literally cannot cast my commander from the command zone. Then I can run a few extra lands. Right, because I want a mulligan to find a specific piece, which means I need every hand I'm mulliganing to have a consistent number of lands in it.
Yeah. So if you think like, hey, I need these 2 things to happen. One is I find this specific piece, and the other, that opening hand has at least 3 lands in it. Well, if I have less lands, then my chances of just having 3 lands in any opening hand is lower. So I find the piece that doesn't meet the second criteria. So what I need to do is up the chance of the second criteria happening, and the way you do that is have more lands in your deck.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes total sense. And then we've already talked about the last one, but it is just, you're playing a land strategy.
You want to play 2 lands every turn, you need 2 lands in your hand.
Yep.
And you run more card advantage to make sure that you have the spells to cast, but you want more lands in your deck. I think my Azizon list runs 41, and honestly, I think that's a hair too low.
Yeah, I remember the land deck I've built, I try and get to 45. And every once in a while, I'm like, because I'm human just like everybody else, I'm like 44 or 43.
Yeah.
But 45 is the benchmark that I want for a land deck just as a default. Just because I know at that number, I have ample lands in hand. And those decks, like you said, if they've got a land, it is part of their plan, so flooding is less of a worry. So having too many lands, that problem solves itself based on what your deck's doing. Yeah. I wanted to wrap this up by just saying, for me, the number one thing that I am looking for when I goldfish, above everything else, is, am I hitting my land drop every turn? That is the number one thing. If I goldfish 50 times and I miss my 5th land drop a third of the time, I need more lands, I need more cards. I got to solve that problem. Whatever it is, I'm going to move stuff around until I'm hitting that, 90% of the time or something. I feel like I'm hitting it a lot. If I notice I'm just missing my 4th or 5th land drop like quite often, the deck is not working. I don't care what else. I just cannot afford to just not hit my land drop. And I really want to go turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, and I'm still hitting it. But by turn 5, I've hopefully gotten some kind of engine online that's letting me draw enough extra cards or look at enough extra cards that I'm confident moving forward I will still hit 6, 7, and 8. But yeah, that's the number one thing I would look at when you're goldfishing. Am I hitting my lands every time? And I'm not talking 10 goldfish 100 times. And then if the answer is like no, you need more lands.
Yeah.
All right. Guess what? The answer is no most of the time for most people.
Yeah. If you were still not sure, you're like, I've listened to this and like you haven't really answered my question, you can start with the template. Just start there. And then listen to yourself when you're goldfishing. Listen to your gut when you're playing. And if you're frustrated with a tech deck, try and find out why. Ask yourself, why am I frustrated by what is happening right now? Am I not hitting my land drops? Am I drawing my pieces out of order? I can never find a sack outlet. Can likely be solved by tweaking one of the knobs that we've talked about today, by increasing your card advantage, by increasing your land count, by decreasing your ramp or increasing your ramp. All of that is just going to make your deck more consistent and more functional. So watch that goldfishing episode. It's how to playtest number 596. That we talk a lot about like what to ask yourself when you're goldfishing to learn about your deck.
Yeah, I think if you haven't watched the goldfishing episode, again, number 596 that we did, it probably will have more level up moments in it for you than basically any episode that I can think of off the top of my head that we've done. Because very few people have to do what we do, which is play a deck in front of a million people, and sometimes it's kind of the first time. I mean, we do some testing, but it's not like these are decks that we built around commanders from new sets, and the sets just came out, and we don't have years to fine-tune these decks. And so we've gotten very good at getting really good functional decks on what looks like V1s, but the reason they are is because we goldfish them hundreds of times. And that process is just, it cannot be beaten. You will have just, your first versions of decks will be very, very good if you know how to goldfish.
Yeah. All right. So we've told you to increase, to decrease, and we've given you rough numbers to start from, but there is a magic number that your deck wants. And we're not going to be able to tell you exactly how, like, you're like, I want more ramp. How much more? Do I want 15? Do I want 20?
Right.
That's not something that we can answer. But I wanted to take a second to go through some of the tools that we use to determine that. One of them is goldfishing and just sort of using the art of that to be like, a little more, a little less. You know, we're cooking without the recipe here.
Right.
But some of it is math. It's math.
The good news is there's a really helpful thing on ARCHIDEKT that will help you figure out some of this math.
Yeah, so everything's sort of a matter of percentages and likelihoods. And there's a lot of tools and calculators that can get you to understand what likelihoods is in your deck right now. So if you're like, I'm never drawing this piece, this will help you answer some of those questions. I'm going to walk you through some of the scenarios that I went through with my decks to give you an idea of how you can use them, but obviously we can't answer every question for every person in this section. So we're just going to answer mine. I want to talk about Sidisi first.
Yep.
The specific problem with Sidisi is
This is Brood Tyrant?
Sidisi Brood Tyrant.
Okay.
So she's a 4-mana commander that when I mill a creature card, I make a zombie token.
Right.
So the way that the deck wins is by self-milling to create an overwhelming board of creatures to run over the table.
Right.
And I really need her on the battlefield as soon as possible to get my plan online. So I want 2-mana ramp on turn 2 so I can cast her on turn 3.
So as many Sakura Tribe Elders as you can get.
If there were 5 Sakura Tribe Elders, I would play
10,
every single one. If there were 15, I would play 15 Sakura Tribe Elders.
Now there aren't, so you have to start getting creative.
Yes. But that means I want 2-mana ramp in my opening hand in nearly every single game so I can cast her on turn 3. That was a big thing that I was trying to do. So what I'm running currently is I'm running 40 lands. I increase the number of lands that I'm running because I'm trying to hit a specific thing. And I'm running currently 12 sources of 2-mana ramp. So a little bit above average from the template. So I used a very cool, powerful deck building tool that was designed by another content creator. This is Salubrious Snail. If you haven't checked out his channel, it's really fascinating. And his website has like deck building calculators on it that you can start asking yourself these questions. So if you're into this stuff, go to his website. It's really cool. I'm going to use 2 of them.
We'll have it linked in the show notes.
Yeah, I'm going to use 2 of the calculators today. But one of them is a calculator that says mulligans for up to 3 card types. So what I did is I put in, all right, I'm running 40 lands and I'm running 12 2-mana ramp cards. And then you hit a success number. So I want to hit 3 lands in my opening hand, and I want at least 1 2-mana ramp card in my opening hand.
Oh, and this tells you the likelihood.
And this tells you how many times you're going to have to mulligan in order to meet that stipulation, which is sweet. So if I want a hand with 3 lands and 1 2-mana ramp spell, currently with my current numbers, I'm 31% likely to have it in my first hand. So not great, honestly.
1 in 3.
1 in 3. And then I'm 53% likely to get it by my first mulligan. So that means
50-50.
50-50 that I have a hand that I want. I am 68% likely to get it by my second mulligan. So at that point, I'll have gone down to 6 cards, but I'm most likely to have found a hand that functions at that point. So honestly, that's not great. Those aren't ideal odds for me to try and get to what I want here. So if I increase that ramp number to 15, things improve. So maybe that's taking some of my ramp in the deck that's 3 mana, or like, I have like an Uro in the deck. Maybe it's not perfect. is pretty good. It's pretty good. But if I increase to 15 2-mana ramp cards, I'm 37% likely to have it in my first hand, and I'm 60% likely to get it by my first mulligan. So that's better.
A lot better, yeah.
That means that I'm like more than half likely to have it before I start going down cards. And then I'm 75% likely to get it by the second mulligan. I could also increase those odds by increasing my land count. So if I went up to 42, again, these numbers do improve. But that gives you an idea of like the kind of things where you're like, okay, well, I'm not super comfortable with like 53% by my first mulligan. So maybe I should increase that number. Maybe it's 15. Maybe it's 18. How comfortable do I want to be that I am going to hit this?
Yeah, and that's the part that's, hard to tell people do this or don't do that. It's the way to think about it. And I think it's like, how badly do you want that to happen? If you want it badly enough, then you, like you said, there's 62 creatures in your deck. You might have to be like, it's more important than everything being a creature, and I'll actually put in a rampant growth or something else just to make that 15 number 17 or 18 or whatever you decide isn't acceptable. You might make those calculations, but at least you know why you're doing it and what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the interesting thing is this is a tool for you to just look at it and be like, oh, okay, so I think I'm running a lot of ramp, but my odds actually aren't that good, even if I'm above what the template suggests for ramp, because my needs to have ramp on turn, in my opening hand, because I'm mulliganing for that, it means that I have to increase this number.
Yeah.
So that's the first tool I wanted to talk about. That's CDC. And honestly, I do think I need to go up to at least 14 and take a look at that. The next one I wanted to talk about was Rakdos. I've talked about him a little bit. He wants to win by dealing damage to reduce the casting cost of my huge threats, which means I need a lot of damage dealers that I can cast before Rakdos, and I want them to be free. So pingers.
You don't have to pay mana to
I want
do
to pay
it.
no mana so I can cast Rakdos the turn and maybe cast a big thing to follow it up. Rakdos, I don't need a ton of ramp. So I prioritize these damage dealers. So I went to a different Salubrious Snail tool. This is on his website. It's card type drawn probability calculator. So I'm running 15 damage dealers that I can activate for free. And currently, I am 78.7% likely to get one of them by turn 2.
Basically, your first 9 cards.
Right.
Yeah.
So the way the tool works is I say I'm running 15 of these, the things that I want, and I want it by what I want one of them by what time.
Yeah.
And I want it on turn 2, then I'm at 78.7%, and then on turn 3, I'm 82.3% to have drawn one of them or have one of them on the battlefield. Those are pretty good odds. I'm happy.
Yeah.
I'm happy with those numbers.
Especially that doesn't even count a mulligan.
That doesn't count a mulligan. That doesn't count that I'm specifically looking for this thing.
Yeah.
Now that's not stipulating I need a certain amount of lands and that kind of thing, but that means that my odds are pretty good for what I'm looking for. So maybe you're 78% is I can go under that, and you want to shave that down to 13 or something like that, which is a percentage you're more comfortable with. But for me, I wanted that number to be nice and high, so I really do like 15. Yeah, if you haven't used his website, you should. It's awesome. He goes through a lot of different deck building skills, so go check out his channel as well. Finally, there's tools on ARCHIDEKT that'll do this. So I want to talk about my Dragon's Approach deck, which I think is always very interesting. For example, how many Dragon's Approach do you play in your deck? Do you know?
I think mine had 28, I think.
28, yeah. You're a little bit higher than mine, but I think you're probably right. Because it's very interesting. So I
haven't played it in a while, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't really either. It's a little gassy, but so I went on ARCHIDEKT, and if you go to their deck builder tool and you scroll down to the bottom, if you've labeled your stuff with categories, it has it all broken down by categories. In my deck list, I want to make sure I've tutored a dragon to the battlefield by turn 6-ish.
Okay.
I want to have either discarded or seen 5 Dragon's Approaches so I can get a dragon on the battlefield.
Yeah.
So by turn 6, I will have default drawn 13 cards, just drawing 1 for every turn, and you're 7. And I looked up the probability of drawing at least 5 Dragon's Approaches, having only drawn 13 cards.
Okay.
It's not great if you start with 25, which is what I have. It's 20%.
Wow.
So you're not going to get to 5 Dragon's Approaches naturally most of the time if you're only running 25. So I looked at 20% and was like, okay, so we either need to run more Dragon's Approaches to increase that percentage, or we need to increase card advantage.
Yeah.
Which is what I've done. My card advantage in that deck is extremely high and extremely cheap because instants and sorceries sort of all work together.
Yep.
So if I wanted to tutor a dragon to the battlefield, I wanted to look at the percentages based on how many cards I've drawn and what percentage I get more comfortable with. So like if I've drawn 13 cards naturally by turn 6, then how many cards would I have to draw by turn 6 to get to a percentage that I'm comfortable with?
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yep.
So if I've drawn 20 cards by turn 6, so that's 7 additional cards.
Which is a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But like if I've cast a wheel, the deck runs
Sure.
3 wheels or something like that. That's 7 additional cards.
Yeah.
I'm 61% likely to have seen 5 Dragon's Approaches by that turn,
Okay.
which is pretty.
Not bad.
It's
Yeah.
pretty good. And then if I've drawn 26 cards, which is way too much, you're like, I don't know how I drew
Things are going really well if you've
13 extra cards
Yeah.
by turn 6. It's 86% likely to happen.
Okay, if you wheel into a wheel.
If I wheel into a wheel and I have the card, the like cost reducers that I play
Yeah.
in that deck, then we're going pretty good.
Okay.
But that's pretty unlikely to happen.
Yeah, that's
so,
unrealistic.
So you're like, okay, based on what I have, I will probably have seen an additional 10 or 11 cards. Not 10 or 11. I've seen an additional like maybe 6 or 7 consistently.
Yeah.
Then I'm 61% likely, which means that I'm probably a little low on the number of Dragon's Approaches that I'm running in my deck.
What would you like that number to be at? 70?
Yeah, probably
Yeah.
at least 65. I think is where I'm like, okay, now I'm
2 out of 3 games.
now I'm like more reasonably following the plan.
Yeah.
Because that deck has a very specific curve. I want to like play a 2-mana rock on turn 2. I want to play Galazeth on turn 3. I want to play 2 Dragon's Approaches on turn 4. Like I've got a plan.
Right. That's pretty specific, but yeah.
But then once you develop that plan, you're like, okay, how likely is that plan to happen? And how can I make it more likely using this tool that just gives you the probability of drawing a certain number of cards like in each category by a certain turn or by a certain number of cards drawn.
Yeah, sometimes it's good to look at the numbers to kind of reinforce, like, okay, I need to figure out a way to like cut 3 cards and put 3 more Dragon's Approach or whatever it is
Yeah.
in. And sometimes just telling yourself, okay, that's a rule and I'm going to do that. And just like, I'll make choices and maybe they're right or maybe they're wrong, but I'll do that and then I'll play the deck and see how it feels from there. Yeah.
And then you start to like, you can start to justify decisions that you've made in your deck and you get to some data that backs up when you're like, I'm never drawing Dragon's Approaches. Is that like a bad luck situation or is that I'm not running enough Dragon's Approach situation?
Yeah, it's good to have numbers that kind of tell you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Cool tools.
Cool tools on ARCHIDEKT, on Salubrious Snail's website. Well, they'll both be in the link below. If you're not using ARCHIDEKT yet, they got a ton of cool deck building tools built into the
really
page.
do.
It's really fun.
All right. The next section you labeled Enough with Math.
Stop! No more math. I understand if you're never going to get that granular with your decks. I totally get it. It is my job, and I am barely getting to that place where I'm like doing math to start justifying my
I'm not sure
stuff.
I've ever gone as deep on percentages
Right.
as we just did for the specifics of my decks. Yeah, I'm definitely more in the like, let me just goldfish it 100 more times.
Yeah,
to
you just
sort of get
build
a
your
feel
own
for-
probability.
But I think
tool.
I'm doing a similar thing
Yeah.
where I'm like, okay, does it feel like, often enough I am, enacting my plan in the order that I want to or whatever. So
Yeah.
quantifying is probably more accurate, honestly.
Yeah.
In some respects, when you know that many specifics, a lot of times there's not that many where it's like, I'm not trying to do a specific road. I just want to be enacting the plan. And it could be any of these other, various things. So that's probably harder to measure with the math.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is just going to be based on reading your feelings and figuring out like, okay, I understand what's happening with my deck, and I know how to fix it.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know what? I'm always getting mana screwed in this deck. I'm not drawing the number of lands that I want to draw. Is it a card advantage problem? Is it a number of lands problem? And how am I going to solve it with my deck list by increasing or decreasing your probability?
Okay, so you've got a lot of common refrains that you hear people say and like what the sort of common answer is. So if somebody says, I'm always getting mana screwed in this deck, even with 38 lands.
Yeah, I mean, you need more lands or you need more card advantage. It just means you're not seeing enough cards or you're certainly not seeing enough lands.
Yeah. To me, it's probably a card advantage problem.
probably. If you're running 38
38s
lands,
and should be enough.
Unless you're hitting extra land drops, and then you should probably increase your land count. If you're like I'm always discarding the hand size because I just can't, like, I have too many cards in my hand and none of them are actually getting on the battlefield. It's either your curve is too high, and you're just drawing too many 5-drops, or you don't have enough mana acceleration to actually use all the card advantage you put in your deck.
Yep. If you say I have to mulligan 3 to 4 times consistently to find a hand that I can keep that has early game plays, that probably means your curve is too high. You don't have enough proactive cheap plays.
I've often found like people will look at the curve tool and be like, I got plenty of two drops. Look at all the 2-drops I have. And then they look at it and they're all removal spells. And you're like, well, you're not going to play that on turn 2 most of the time. You need 2 mana stuff that does something for your board. And
plus, I'd say the commander curve doesn't really look like a bell.
Yeah.
It looks like a cliff that that's high on the left side and really drops off all of a sudden on the right side.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next common refrain is, I'm not sure what's wrong exactly. I just draw stuff out of order.
Yeah, you're likely, either your deck goes in too many directions where you're just trying too many things. You want too many things to happen. Yeah. You're like, I need this and then that and this and that, then that. It's a lot to ask of your deck.
Yeah.
So you could reduce the number of directions that your deck is going for, reduce the number of things that you need to happen, or you just don't have enough card selection or advantage. Try some looters, try some more card draw, try even some like ponders, like cantrips. And you can start reorganizing your cards, finding what you need.
I do think if there is a most common sort of novice deck builder mistake, or if there are two, one is trying to do too many things. Decks just really aren't going to be able to do, they're not going to be able to encapsulate like 3 ideas. You really can't even encapsulate 2. You might be able to do 1 with a really tiny side plan that's 2 or 3 cards, but like you're lucky if you can even make the 1 work. So yeah, that's number 1. And the other one, which we alluded to, is just too high a curve and not enough early gameplay. So they're set up. They're either not doing things early, or the things they're doing early are not, really leading into what the deck wants to do. It's like they look like okay plays, but it's like Secure Tribe Elder or something where you don't have any recursion and you don't have the other pieces. And it's like, no, the ramp should maybe be something else because of what your deck's trying to do. And so, listening to Rachel talk about the Sidisi deck, how she's like, hey, that's 62 creatures. Like she held very hard to, that's the plan of my deck. And I think sometimes the curve can look okay and everything else, but they haven't made that choice about their deck. It's like, no, my deck cares about this, and I need to be really stringent that like, yeah, I do have a ramp piece, but now my ramp piece to get to the next level for my deck needs to be also a plan piece.
Overlap. It just makes your decks feel stronger. And when in doubt, follow your gut. When you're like, I can't figure out what's wrong with my deck, I'm not drawing enough lands. Maybe draw some more, or put some more lands in. One of those 2 things will be very helpful for your deck.
I will say card draw solves most problems.
It does.
And that would be what I would try to solve. Well, first thing, do I have 38 lands? If that answer is yes, I would just try and increase card draw. It's amazing. And I still learn this lesson every time I build a deck. I was building a deck for game nights recently. And I was like, it's just not working. And I just added in 4 more pieces of card draw that were related to my plan. And the deck just immediately hummed. And I was like, what? I love card draw. How do I still have to learn this lesson?
Yep. It's I think card draw is the drink more water of Magic.
Yeah.
It's just like, are you feeling bad?
Yeah.
You need more cards.
Yeah.
Did you sleep last night?
Yeah.
And you're like,
just drink more water.
Yeah, drink more water. It'll make you feel better.
Yeah.
You have a headache? Drink more water.
So try that first, and then you can always. I think people don't think about this enough. I'm always like, just try it.
Yeah.
It's a couple clicks of a mouse and it's not very much time. And then you can always be like, that didn't work. I'm going back to what I had. There's nothing, it doesn't cost you anything. Like, it's all digital now. So just try adding more card draw. There's no reason to even think about it. Just add some and then play the deck. And if that's like, no, it still feels the same. Cool. Now you know it's not that. Yeah.
It's something else.
Yeah.
You're a chef, taste it every so often and figure out like, a little of this, a little of that. To the listeners, What deck of yours blows the deck building template wide open? These are my favorite decks to look at when you're suddenly like, this is my 8-land Octavia list. And you're like, what? How? Show
crazy.
me. I want to talk about that. Or if you're like, I run 30 pieces of ramp and, only 2 creatures. I don't know what you're doing, but cool.
Sounds like a storm deck.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I don't know what you're doing. What tools do you use to maximize your deck's effectiveness? If you've got a calculator that you use, if you use ARCHIDEKT, let us know what your favorite feature is. We're always looking for new, cool ways to deck build over here. So put those in the comments below.
Yeah, you can put it on everybody else's radar, too, out there in audience land. So that's great. All right, before we go, let's talk about our sponsors, cardkingdom.com/command. That is the best place to go to buy your Magic products, singles, anything at all. Ether Drift, it just came out, but we've already got Tarkir Dragonstorm right around the corner. If you're like me, you still haven't caught up with, Foundations all the way. I don't have enough High Fate Tristers yet. I only have 2. And
What?
And I need to add it to, 4 more decks. So
Every time you've played it, I've been like, that card's busted.
it's so good.
It's
I'm
so
back in the old
crazy.
days. I can play the card that I love. So I'm definitely going to be going to cardkingdom.com/command very soon in order to pick up more High Fate Tricksters and also, all the cards that we need for our decks. They have everything in every version and every condition. And what we love about them is they're professionals. They get your stuff as fast as possible. Also, this time of year, if you order from other places that aren't as professional, sometimes things happen, and this happened to me, where cards arrive and they didn't package it right and it's all soggy, and then you have to go through the hassle of trying to go through customer support, and if they're individuals, sometimes that doesn't work out very well, and you never really kind of. Card Kingdom's not like that. They're professional business. They handle it. First of all, they send it to you the right way. They know, how to send it so that it's not going to get all soggy in water. And then if anything happens, they have an entire customer service department, and they always make things right. And that's what I love about them. So we use them for all of our own stuff because they are so pro and because they have such a great inventory. So cardkingdom.com/command.
Yeah, and once those cards are in your hand, you're going to need to protect them from the wind and the rain. Go to ultrapro.com/command to get the sleeves and deck boxes, binders, playmats, everything that you need to play Magic, to play any sort of trading card game. Go check out the Ultra Pro website. They're doing merch now, but also, they have everything that you know and love about Ultra Pro. You got the officially licensed art from Magic on the playmat, on the sleeves. If you've got a commander that you love, go check out their website, even if it was from a couple sets ago. Sometimes they've still got them in stock, and you can deck out your favorite deck. Get the sleeves that match the deck box, match the playmat. Be very snazzy at your next game night. Plus, they've got great deals if you're paying attention to their website or if you've signed up for their newsletter. Go to ultrapro.com/command, and you're supporting the show while you shop.
All right, big thanks to our amazing team here at the Command Zone. Rachel Kendra, Karina Cruz, Sebastian Salazar, Grav Galati, Jamie Block, Jordan Pridgeon, Jake Boss, Eric Lem, Josh Murphy, Manson Lung, Christopher Matista, Evan Limburger, Sam Waldo, and of course, Jimmy Wong. All right, everybody, thanks for watching.
Ooh,
Whoa, that was like a boomerang.
that was so high.
Came back.
Bye.
Peace.